In today's video, we are going to explore the King's Gambit, and we are going to do that by looking at three Chessmaster games. We start off with Alexei Shirov, an international master rated 2500, and his exploration of the King's Gambit. Then we're going to move on to Nigel Short, a grandmaster and absolute chess legend, and we'll finish it off with the king of the King's Gambit himself, Boris Spassky. He's the best King's Gambit player of all time. These three games will help fully explain the King's Gambit, so I hope you enjoy. It starts here after e4. The whole point is our opponent will play e5, and while we have a variety of options, for example, just pushing d4, developing the knights, d3, getting the bishop involved on c4 maybe, we're going to go with a dubious f4, but it's quite exciting, even though this isn't necessarily the best line. You're going to put yourself in a very strong attacking position. You get serious tempo here. This pawn is very difficult to defend. For example, a d4 push attacks the pawn right away. Knight to f3 is a great idea because you want to prevent the queen from checking. Bishop to c4, saying I'm going to put pressure on f7 right away. These are all valid options that you will see in the King's Gambit. For our first game with Alexei Shirov, we're going to see the popular knight f3 variation. Notice here the queen cannot go ahead and check because the knight is defending that dark square. So, okay, we go ahead and we see that g5 is being played here. So g5, we can't just take back with the knight. The queen is defending, of course, and he is threatening this g4 push. We don't have to necessarily deal with it just yet. So Shirov plays c4, right? We're going to attack the f7 square. And of course, we could have predicted this. Now, when we explore Boris Spassky's game at the very end, you will see how you can actually defend this knight. But in this case, Shirov plays the exciting but less accurate move, castles, sacrificing the knight but gaining a massive attack on the f7 square. Notice all the pieces are aligning, and once again, that d4 push is still available if we want to add that extra attacker really to f4. So, okay, the queen jumps in front, and we're going to go ahead and push e5. Now, the queen's going to take back because rook cannot go to e1. Normally, you'd be afraid of the e1 play because it would actually hook the queen to the king, and you'd be able to win. But in this case, the rook would be undefended, so you'd just be losing a rook for no reason. So he has no problem taking. But of course, bishop f7 is not necessarily what Alexei's opponent was really expecting, right? Because now you're down 6 points of material, but the attack's not over yet. When you're playing the King's Gambit, you want to be extremely aggressive, and he does that by playing d4, inviting check from the queen because we have bishop e3, a ridiculous counter that not only gets sub check but gives us a tempo. If queen takes, queen can just take back, and this pawn is not going to be able to take. This is a pin, meaning that if the pawn was to take the queen, you would be going into check, which is, of course, illegal. So this is not a possibility. You instead have to bring the queen back to f6. Bishop takes on f4. And really now, the king is just going to try to get back to his home square. I think at this point, you're feeling very doomed here. At some point, you're going to be able to maybe connect the king to the queen and win that piece. So he doesn't want to get pinned, right? So the knight's coming, and you would think the next move is probably d5, looking to attack c7, which already has some pressure. And this comes with an attack on the queen as well. So allowing d5 will be bad for black. Of course, he does allow it, and I can see how the pressure is really getting to our opponent, but at the international master level, there's no excuse for allowing knight to d5. There's literally no way you can defend the fork. And really the insane part here is he's not even going for the fork. As you can see, not only is the fork available whenever he wants it, but the rooks are connected and on open files. So of course, just rook to e1, checking the king. Now the bishop moves over, and the reason for that is quite simple. If you just move over with the king, bishop c7 is actually checkmate. The diagonal here is covered, and you can't take the bishop because it's defended by the knight. So instead, bishop to e7. Notice that two knights and the king are defending the bishop. So maybe it's not so bad. The fork's still available, but our opponent's up 6 points of material. Except bishop to d6. This is insane. But really, how do you defend this? So the idea here is actually pretty sinister. Queen to f8, reinforced by the bishop, mating the king. So that's one thing. So then you gotta think, okay, but I gotta take the bishop. But taking the bishop isn't really the best idea either. In fact, while there looks like there's three ways to do it, there's actually only two, and both of those lead to mate. For example, pawn takes here is checkmate. Notice the bishop's pins, so you don't even have that option of taking back with the bishop. Um, the same option will occur with the queen. It's just a reinforced pinned bishop. Once again, Sheriff shows a clear understanding of how to utilize pins because this bishop is useless. The rook is reinforcing, and then there's just no way to take. So that's mate as well. Okay. So with that in mind, we can't really take at all. The king moves over, and it's pretty much desperation mode. Notice that just queen to f8 sacrifice. And after bishop takes back, you would eventually have mate with rook to f8. But the more accurate move, bishop c7, checkmate, e-file covered, bishop check. And we see that while being down 14 points of material, Shirov can pull off an absolutely spectacular and gorgeous checkmate. Now, an interesting tidbit about this next game, while this was played by Nigel Short, you may recognize his opponent, Garry Kasparov, one of the top three best chess players of all time. In my opinion, you can put him at one, you can put him at three. He's very, very good. And this was actually played in the World Championships. Nigel Short, the greatest British chess player of all time, was the only chess player from Great Britain to actually make it to the finals. And he pulled out the King's Gambit on the king of chess. Um, and while we were seeing knight to f3 before, we're now seeing the bishop c4 variation. Now, Bobby Fischer actually preferred this. And we'll go into kind of the lore of Bobby Fischer versus Boris Spassky, who we're going to go into that game at the very end. Spoiler alert. But for now, queen to h4. Now, Fischer does believe that this is the better line for white. The downside is this. You can't defend with any of your pieces, so your king is stuck in the middle of the board, but evidently there are enough attacking chances here where you're okay with having your king in the center of the board, and you're actually not in that much danger, and you'll still be able to push d4. So this was a more of a dubious move by Kasparov, just trying to push the bishop away from the action. Bishop just takes there, and then after the knight comes to attack that pawn, knight to f3. You don't always have to just defend and react to your opponent. You can just go ahead and attack the queen instead, forcing him back. The knight comes out to defend, and g5. I'm pretty sure you'll see g5 in most of these King's Gambit games at some point. This f pawn is very weak, and you're going to want to try to protect it at all costs. So d4, another defining move. Usually knight f3, bishop to c4, though the bishop was dislodged, and then the d4 push. These are kind of the defining moves of the King's Gambit. If you're going to note how to actually play it, the order to me does matter. I think knight f3 is best. Just because I don't like my king being in the center of the board, I'd be more comfortable with this position if I was castled. So the bishop comes to kettle. There's a lot of pressure here on e4, and we go ahead and push h4. The push here, to me, was probably the correct move. I think knight to e5 was playable, and Gasparov was a little bit nervous about that prospect. But he plays rook to g8 instead. While it may look like the pawn could take back, notice that the rook is not protected by anything because the rooks aren't connected because there's no castle. So first, you will have to go ahead and move that king over to g1 to defend the rook. Now that pawn take is possible. We can still take here because the knight is defending the rook. And after we do some reshuffling, this to me is the crucial mistake of the game. And if there's going to be a theme to the first two games, it's the pins. Knight takes an e4, but you're going to see how a grandmaster takes advantage of this and wins back the knight. Now, no doubt, Garry Kasparov felt as though f5 would have defended the knight, and he wasn't going to lose massive material. and he was very excited about his prospects of the G2 checkmate. However, after rook takes, right, adding that extra attacker to the fray, there's three attackers and the knight's not moving. The f5 move is played, knight to h4, and the queen moves over to g5. Um, this is where it's pretty much game over. So he was trying to protect the f5 pawn, but what I want you to notice is he lines his queen up on the bishop's diagonal, meaning the c1 bishop's about to become very, very active. It's going to take out the queen. And the way you do this and the correct technique here, knight takes, bishop takes, and then rook takes. Bishop is taken. We are sacrificing the exchange, but in turn, the queen hangs. So pawn takes back. And now there's some debate about what the best move is here. Bishop takes is fine. Just simply queen to e4, forking the rook and the king, and then taking the queen is also a highly active move. We'll never know what would have been played because Garry Kasparov resigns here. And Nigel Short gets a big win in the World Championships. Before we get into the greatest rivalry of all time, go ahead, drop a like, subscribe to the video, help me help you get better at chess. Either way, we're going to go into Boris Spassky versus Bobby Fischer, the greatest rivalry of all time. And there's actually a lot of lore to this particular game. And we're actually going to be watching this from Boris Spassky's perspective. He is considered to be the greatest King's Gambit player of all time. And at the time, he was the best player of his generation. Bobby Fischer was the young up-and-comer who many thought was stronger, and he did prove to be stronger, but he had a very tough time cracking Boris Spassky's King's Gambit. It really threw Bobby Fischer off, as it throws off a majority of chess players. This actually forced Bobby Fischer to create his own variation called the Fischer defense. If you want to see a video on that, go ahead and let me know in the comment section. So we started this game off like all the rest with the King's Gambit, and we played knight to f3, preventing the queen to h4 idea, and pretty much invoking that g5 push. Boris Spassky is convinced that if he pulls Bobby Fischer out of theory, he will be in good shape, and he plays the extremely dubious h4. I promise, guys, you would probably want to go with a d4, bishop c4 idea. This idea to me isn't as good because you're provoking g4 anyway. And now you can't castle like in the first game. But Boris Spassky seems to have a plan here, playing knight to e5. He's going to play d4 and bishop to c4 anyway, and create an attack on the f7 square. And that is basically what we see immediately. The knight takes on the pawn, but the bishop just is going to take back on f4, right? And you see a very weird structure here immediately. Boris Spassky is basically just trying to develop. He'll actually go ahead and sacrifice the c3 pawn as well, and castle into what looks to be a very dubious position. Queen could just take the h4 pawn, it's hanging, and then maybe there's going to be a pawn storm. So for Spassky to play something like this against Bobby Fischer is to me completely unrealistic, but he does do it. So there you go. Knight to c6, and then we play bishop to g4. Bishop is going to eventually take, but not before castling into a catastrophic position. Castling to me, it's too risky. And after bishop takes, rook takes, and then queen to g4, you can kind of see why. The bishop is pinned. Even bishop to h6, if you don't play this correctly, could just be a mating threat on the spot. So dangerous stuff, but the king's just going to eventually move out of the way. After an f5 push, queen moves down to g3, pawn takes, rook moves over, and then, yep, king to h8. The rook is going to come on to g8 anyway, but to me, I would have castled long. I think Bobby Fischer would have had a much better shot at winning this game. Instead, after the king moves over as well, trying to get out of this little G file, which is about to become a battle zone to say the least. The rook's going to move over anyway. Bishop takes on d6. Bishop to f8. There's actually a pretty simple solution to this. Obviously, you're double attacking the bishop and discovering the queen. But just by moving the bishop back to check the king, it allows you to survive and at least live to see another day. The knight can take, but then the queen can just take back, and you're still in check. Defends with the rook here. Defending with the bishop would have been interesting too, because it would have came with an attack on the queen. But either way, rook is going to take here. And after queen takes that h4 pawn, we move over. The queen comes to g4. This is going to be maiden one, so you'll have to move either the rook or the queen back to defend that checkmate. In this case, the rook comes back to f2. He's trying to keep the queen pinning the rook and this battering ram active and alive. And this knight will get involved at some point as well. The bishop comes to e7, and this to me is where he's maybe getting a little aggressive. I believe this bishop is looking to route to h4 to add pressure to this rook and maybe force him over. But it becomes a big target, and Boris Spassky immediately acts on it. First, rook to e4, attacking the queen, and the queen really can't take back. He's just going to have to retreat. Um, but he has to keep a defender on the bishop as well. I know the rook is there defending, um, but you have to try to keep this bishop defended because after the queen moves back to e4, the rook moves over, and then rook to e5. We're already looking at a lost position. Notice that this rook has now become a liability. Yes, you can take the rook back, but then the queen is hanging. So you have to protect the queen. But once you do protect the queen, you would lose the bishop. Which is why he plays rook to d8, right? Because he says, okay, you take, I take, and we're okay. But Boris Spassky says, well, that's not how this is going to work. Queen to e4. The big issue beforehand with this position was that the queen was in front. So if queen takes bishop, rook takes queen, and you end up trading a queen for a bishop and a rook, which is slightly losing for you. Because it's a battering ram now, and we're forcing the queen away from the defense of the bishop, it turns out that we're just going to win a bishop. And the reason for this is simple. You can't play the queen to f6. You also can't play queen to h4. Queen to h4, you think, well, the bishop is defending here, but not so fast because rook just takes. If rook takes back, then the queen's hanging. And if the queen takes, the rook just comes back. This knight is defended. The whole position is completely together. He is down a pawn, but Boris Spassky is up a knight. And this is why Bobby Fischer created the Fischer defense, because this game completely destroyed his psyche. Either way, guys, based on the tools that you've developed here by watching some really talented chess players play the King's Gambits, you should be able to go out there and absolutely destroy that opening. If you enjoyed this video, we got the same exact formula, but for a bunch of other really cool openings, so go ahead and check that out. Stay classy, my friends.